All right, everybody, welcome back. So we just talked some great stuff about investments, markets, commercialization, partnerships, stuff like that. So let's keep that going. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, private investment in space companies reached new highs in 2020, and 2021 looks very much on pace to beat that record. Why? What's going on? How's this happening? So we've assembled our next panel of experts to help us understand what's driving this trend. This panel will be moderated by Carissa Christensen, who will be joined by Tess Hatch, Eric Stallmer, Sunil Nagaraj, and Thomas Gillespie. Carissa Christensen is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Bryce Tech. She previously co-founded defense company, the Tari Group, and quantum computing software company, QX Branch, and she's internationally recognized expert on R&D processes, technology forecasting, and the space industry. She guest lectures at universities internationally, has testified before Congress on space markets, and speaks regularly at various events, including the White House Frontiers Conference, the Harvard Business School Dialogue, and she's something of a regular at our own American Astronautical Society symposia, like the Glenn Symposium that we just held last month. She's often cited in various publications like New York Times, the Washington Post, Wired, etc. And so I'm going to stop there and turn it over to you, Krista. Good to see you again.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here today. And it's a pleasure to be having a discussion about commercial space following some energy injected into the topic by Jeff Mamber, which I've been doing for a couple decades now. We've got a really extraordinary panel today because we've got a panel of investors. We're going to be talking to Tess Hatch. Tess is a partner at Bessemer Venture Partners. She's an aerospace engineer who focuses on commercial space and as well as drones, autonomous vehicles, and agriculture and food tech. She serves on the board of directors for Phantom Auto, Spire Global, Iris Automation. She's a board observer for Rocket Lab and a few other companies. Tess teaches at her alma mater, Stanford University, and also sits on the advisory board for the Stanford Technology Ventures program. She previously worked at a couple little companies called Boeing and SpaceX. So we're thrilled to have Tess as part of the panel. We're going to be talking to Eric Stallmer, the Executive Vice President for Government Affairs and Public Policy at Voyager Space. Eric leads Voyager's DC office. He represents Voyager to the government. He, prior to joining Voyager, was the president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. He helped craft the modern Commercial Space Launch Act. And he also, Eric, served for many years as a reserve officer in the U.S. Army and is the recipient of a Bronze Star, and is also my very dear friend. So I'm delighted to have Eric with us today. Also on our panel, Sunil Nagaraj, who is the founder and managing partner of Ubiquity Ventures. Which is a seed stage institutional venture capital firm with close to $100 million under management. And Sunil has just the most compelling, I think, investment thesis, which is software beyond the screen, startups focusing on software beyond the screen. Prior to Ubiquity, Sunil worked with Bessemer Venture Partners, and he led seed and Series A rounds for some very successful startups, including Rocket Lab, Spire, Tile, and Twitch, which Amazon acquired. Finally, we are joined by Tom Gillespie, who is managing partner of InQtel's investment team, where he's identifying technologies that address challenges faced by the intelligence community. So Tom straddles the venture and government worlds in a very practical day-to-day way. He is the team partner associated with InQtel's commercial space initiative, Cosmic Works, with a Q, of course. He's led a number of investments into commercial space ventures, launch vehicles, small sats, and space situational awareness, as well as investments in a variety of aligned technology areas like robotics and autonomous systems. Tom also has a history that includes startups, including founding Launch Fuel, which was looking at creating, developing, and advising early stage tech businesses. So we've got a panel of people who are day to day putting money into the space economy and making choices and taking risks and seeking returns from that space economy. And it's as Sven said, it's a hot economy. We've seen venture investment in the billions since 2015 every year. 2021 was along the lines of $7 billion. We've seen in the last 8 quarters a number of SPACs with a total enterprise value of $20 billion of space companies going public. So the first question I'd like to start with to our panel is, what's your view of the current space economy? What's your perspective? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What are we looking at? And Tess, perhaps you can kick us off.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me today, Carissa, Sven, and all of ISSRDC. There are 2 very significant milestones in the space economy and the space market in 2021 in this year. The first is the number of space companies that are going public via SPAC. Before 2021, there were only a handful of liquidity events in the space industry that I think was really holding back the industry, the lack of at least venture exits. And this year, we're delighted that Rocket Lab and Spire announced their SPAC mergers on March 1st, and they are on the way, along with a handful of other space companies that are really paving a path for the next generation of space companies to follow in their footsteps. The second is the billionaires taking selfies in space. The race between Richard and Jeff, which who both successfully did take their selfie in space on July 11th and 20th. And it's really bringing a lot of attention to the space market. It's exciting. It's the public is very interested, and it accounts for $1 billion of an overall $350 billion market. So at the moment, it's a small slice, but it's bringing attention to the rest of the market that we use every day to watch TV, listen to the radio, or navigate us to our destination.
Selfies in space is a precise and eloquent way of putting what we've seen over the last few weeks. Eric, what's your view of the environment, the opportunities and challenges that we're seeing right now?
Well, certainly they're plentiful in a wide range of areas. I think they're plentiful. I think there's several areas of opportunity beyond just the launch industry, which I think historically investors looked at because that was the big shiny objects. But there is so much more going on in space, so many more capabilities that are enabling the total space ecosystem. I saw there was a report that came out just the other day about 6 areas that the DoD really needs to focus on, and work with commercial partners on, and a range from on-orbit servicing to the spaceports to lunar resources and extraction and things of that nature. So it's really broadening the horizon and really expanding the space economy from what it was. Let's say, we all different metrics, but 10 years ago, when I really, engaged in the commercial industry as a much larger aspect from Commercial Spaceflight Federation, where the companies were, where the monies were, where the opportunities people were following, and moreover, how much was being invested from the private sector. All those areas have just multiplied in many ways. So I think that now is really, I don't use the phrase, the cliche, the golden age, but it really is the right time to be investing, and in a range of different areas that are sometimes your non-traditional avenues and technologies, but very much will help drive the market. So I'm very excited about what's going on.
Thanks, Eric. So Tess made the important point that we're seeing exits, and I think that it's hard to emphasize that too much, because for so many years, the driver around expectation was the high valuation of SpaceX, for example, and a couple of exits, Skybox, for example, that were not driving, energizing the market in the way that you would hope. Eric is talking about not only government demand, but military demand, which has a persistence and a necessity to it that can be very attractive. Sunil, what would you add to those points?
I think it's been a really long road to get here, going back to like Teledesic and the false start of the 90s. Carissa, you mentioned Skybox in 2014. That was $500 million. And I think that kickstarted some enthusiasm. In many ways, I think that triggered the next wave of the next maybe 20 mainstream VC firms to explore the space. Today, in August 2021, this is our time to shine. You know, in many ways, we had a lot of ideas, but no capital 5-7 years ago when I would go to space conferences. I was the only VC within 100 miles. And now there are many. The flip side is, though, we need to make sure the sector doesn't overheat. Now, that's a collective responsibility, but I do think there's an ongoing risk that the wrong ideas raise too much capital, have a very public failure, and it can spook investors from the sector. You get a lot of "I told you so's." So we should capitalize on the opportunity. Capital is available. There are the haves and have-nots, but there are many seed companies I'm meeting that are in space, and then there's the many bellwether companies that keep raising more billions of dollars. And this is great, provided that we're responsible. We focus on real revenue metrics. Even if you can get away with raising a lot of money pre-revenue or pre-launch, don't do so. It could really tank the whole industry the way that a few companies in the 90s did that. But at the same time, we should be celebrating. Everyone's worked really hard for this for 5 or 6 years now. Since I'm thinking about 2014, 2015, this is the time to make ideas happen. And I'm seeing an explosion of startups doing direct applications, startups supporting those. So you're actually having the whole ecosystem come together. It takes a village, and we're seeing that emerge.
I think that we will come back over and over in this conversation to that topic of the realism of the market. What is the right valuation? What's the right size of a raise? There is a lot of capital available. There's a lot of energy and excitement around space. And one of the interesting things with the SPACs is that because those are companies that are going public, we're starting to see the financial position of those companies going public and what it looks like. And so, Sunil, I think that's a really interesting thread to pull. Tom, how would you wrap up the discussion of opportunities and challenges right now?
Yeah, first of all, I double down on what Sunil just said, which is it's really exciting to see the exits and the SPACs. I worry a little bit about sort of the across the board quality of them. So there's some great companies that are getting exits at this point, but we got to make sure that they're the right ones that are getting out and telling the right story, because right now, if you're raising money, whether it's via SPAC or just a normal private round, you're doing it on the backs of the expectation that it'll just keep flowing as it is. And if that sort of train stops at some point, I think it's going to affect the whole sector. Looks good right now, but I want to make sure, to Sunil's points, that that we've got the right metrics in place, and these things are really making money and are real businesses. I'd also add, just on the government side, that's another thing that's changed over the last probably 6 or 7 years, is the maturation of how the government in general looks at commercial space and the ways that it can help the mission and add to what they're doing on the government side. And also, I think, and this is still a work in progress, but starting to think of these things as vendors to the government. So the government is a buyer. You don't have to own the capability. They can just show up as a customer and get what they need. And I think that's something that's sort of progressing, but still working its way through. So I think as we look forward to the next few years, if that continues, I think that'll be a really good thing for the commercial market.
So to building on Eric's point, the government as having a requirement, but also the government being an increasingly sophisticated customer for commercial products and services. So let's
understanding how to use it and leverage commercial market and not resisting the offerings.
Not resisting. I think that may be not an entirely fully solved problem. But fair enough. So let's pull on this side. Let's explore this idea of what is a good investable business what is how do you evaluate that? What's an appropriate amount to raise? What's the downside? I think a lot of people would think that from a founder's standpoint, a very high valuation is always good, as opposed to maybe creating some challenges. So, Sunil, let's start with you. What are the business ideas that are coming to fruition? Where are they happening? What looks exciting? And what are some of the cautionary notes about how that investment should look?
That's a great question, Carissa. Let me remind everyone I'm a seed investor. And what that means at some level is whenever there's a line for something, I usually go the other direction. So there will be, what I'm looking for, 1-2 person teams that are just starting. And if a space is exciting, that's not the place I'm going to be looking just because I'm a seed investor, which is not the same as of saying it's a bad area to invest. More broadly, the areas, I think this notion of Earth observation EO is having all the nooks and crannies explored, different spectra, different resolution, different revisit. And there are, any combination of that tuple, you'll see maybe 4 or 5 companies pursuing that right now. That's a good thing because there are different folks and different customers and different ways to look at the world, whether it's hyperspectral or SAR, whether it's every day or every minute. That has been going on for a while, but it's great to see many of those companies have on-asset orbits generating revenue in space. Another area, especially as it relates to this particular conference, one that I saw in the booths back pre-COVID a lot, was microgravity production. And I think that continues to be promising, still looking for that low mass, high value set of objects, products that can be created. But there's been a few more companies in the space that have been funded. And then full disclosure, I have an investment in Loft Orbital, but that's in the category of opening up space for more people. And I think this notion of an extraction layer, the same way that AWS made it dead simple to take 20 lines of Python, give it to somebody, and now the whole world can use your app. Same thing with Loft Orbital. You take a payload, attach it, and Loft Orbital handles it from there. And I think that's a really exciting one. I think there's a big opportunity in the space sector to pull dollars from outside the space sector. I usually, every time I met a space startup, I would think, is there revenue coming from within the sector or outside the sector? And like Spire, for example, Rocket Lab and Spire is a great compare and contrast. Rocket Lab, almost all the money is in the space sector, but it turns out to be one of the biggest purchases a space company makes is their launch. Spire, all the revenue is outside the space sector. And I think that's pretty cool to see. The last area, which I alluded to earlier, was infrastructure. Starting to see companies helping companies now. One that I met recently, and I think he's been at this conference before, is Eric at Scout. And here the idea is to not just have satellites in orbit and not just have those satellites be serviced, but eventually you need someone to watch the servicing of the satellite. So you get meta layer on top of meta layer. It gets a little theoretical and heady, but it is actually really useful. I mean, if you think about any other industry, there are several layers deep of infrastructure providers. And so that's another area I'm seeing more and more of as there are more satellites in space.
Thanks, Sunil. Tess, what's your sense of where the interesting businesses are showing up and what makes them investable?
I would love to partner and invest in a unique sensor utilizing the cube or microsat form factor in low Earth orbit. I don't think we need another fantasy rocket or another satellite propulsion company. There are lots of those. Not to say there's not room for multiple rockets in the industry. Right now, we really only have SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Rocket Lab's Electron. We could definitely have more, at least American private rockets, but there's hundreds. We don't need another tiny rocket. Doubling down on, so what does a unique sensor in low Earth orbit mean? After the invention of the CubeSat, a new form factor that really flipped the model of launching assets into space. Before, it was a school bus size satellite that would take years, if not tens of years, and millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to design, build, test, and launch into space. The CubeSat really lowered the barrier of entry. It opened space for business to allow you to throw your cell phone on a CubeSat. And people did. And therefore, the two sensors people have flocked to the most are the camera on our cell phone and the communication that our cell phone provides. So all of these companies are working on launching constellations to take photos of the Earth and communicate with the Earth. And And what I think was really awesome that Sunil saw in Spire that does a really good job is we're going to listen to the Earth. Spire listens to the AIS sensors from maritime or the ADS-B from aviation, and then now has GPS radial occultation sensors for weather data, which all of this information is incredibly important and you can only get from space. So I look forward to partnering and investing in entrepreneurs' imaginations of unique sensors in space that either help Earth or help space.
So, Tom, this is what you do day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, is look for these opportunities and with an additional layer of matching them to government, particularly intelligence community, although InQtel represents an array of government agencies. What's your view of what you're seeing that's interesting and differentiated, and what's investable?
Yeah, so I should note that our model requires co-investment with other VCs like Bessemer. So we're looking at a lot of the same things that your typical financial VCs are, maybe just doing it with a slightly different angle of, is there a government customer that can match up with this? Things we find are interesting right now, I'd say across maybe 3 or 4 different areas. One is sort of this next phase of the in-space economy and logistics. We've done a pretty good job of covering the launch vehicles and the constellations and sort of the first wave of things. And what's next for us, I think, is what's really happening in space. How do you operate up there? The more satellites that go in orbit, what are the things that can happen now that couldn't happen a few years ago? So satellite servicing, manufacturing, a variety of different types of logistics. That's one angle that we're looking at now. Another is, and I heard this alluded to earlier, sort of taking non-space companies but finding space applications for them. And so examples would be additive manufacturing. Some cyber companies we're working with and are now looking to apply that to the space domain. Things like that, where you don't think of them as space companies, but they might have relevance in the space domain. And then, I'd say in general, I find some of the companies to be most interesting that are, maybe they're doing one thing right now, and I'll use Rocket Labs as an example. Yes, it's a small sat launch vehicle, but that's a company that's going to broaden into a lot of different areas and I think really grow. So it's not just a one-dimensional company. And I think the companies that have that potential to grow in, the sort of adjacent markets are really interesting.
Thanks, Tom. Eric, Voyager is looking at investable companies, looking at the marketplace with a little bit of a different spin, because Voyager has a participation or an acquisition or an integration model. So from your perspective, what are the interesting companies? What's investable?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it kind of lends to the aspect that we're not making these investments into these companies for capabilities further on. We're looking at companies that have revenues, that have capabilities, and that's the most important thing that we are looking at right now, is capabilities that fit into our business model of vertically and horizontally integrating these companies together. So that could be a range of different things, commercial space stations, which, as we're looking, and more commercialization of LEO companies that are doing that actively have been engaged in areas like that, that have contracts with the DoD that have been a little bit established, that we can help augment these companies and help them grow and integrate into the capabilities that we're looking at as an emerging company. I should say, we have to be very thoughtful about this, because we're in for the long haul. We're not trying to buy companies, take these capabilities, certain capabilities they have, get rid of that other part of the company. That's not the business model that we've kind of addressed. So we're kind of looking, for these companies that have meaningful capabilities that, we can work well with all aspects of the government, but also with the commercial partners, with the current capabilities that we have right now, which is a very exciting part of what we do, because there's been so many different types of companies. And I think it was that Tess pointed out, how many launch companies have kind of emerged, and the next great launch technology. we're not there. The launch is accessible right now, and it's plentiful. There'll be more that come online. There's obviously the existing capabilities right now. So we're not focusing in areas like that, but areas that can really help humanity, help the space infrastructure grow, to help commercialize space even more than it is, and really to help change the business model of dealing and working in space. Whether that be working with the government, on newer, more efficient acquisition systems, which I think we're moving in that right direction. Although it's like moving a large ship. It takes time to turn, but it is turning. And as well as we're working with international and global partners. I think that's critical to as we grow this space economy, and it's not just limited to our shores here. We have to look and broaden our horizons and look at different capabilities there.
So we've been talking about the breadth of companies across the space ecosystem, and I think it's very useful to sort of group them. So there are satellite companies and all the companies in the satellite value chain, and that's basically a digital economy that serves people outside. I think that's a great outside versus inside the sector. That serves people outside the sector, largely. Then there is what I'll call in-space activity, and that's physical activities in space, whether that's transporting people, whether that's building platforms, whether conducting operations on platforms, manufacturing things in space. And there's energy and effort to find customers outside the sector, but the payers there are mostly still government agencies, space companies doing R&D. There are companies outside the sector that are doing some experiments in space, but really that financial flow is still largely space organizations. And then there's launch, which supports both. So if those are the three kind of sectors, we've seen a lot of increasingly mature activity in startup satellite companies and a very mature satellite industry for decades. We've seen a lot of investment in launch, which we could probably spend 2 or 3 hours talking about. But let's talk about that in-space piece. We had a great question from the audience saying, do we see investor interests in commercial space stations? Like we've seen interest in launch and satellites. I think we want to think about on-orbit servicing, space-based manufacturing. So how do you view the attractive or less attractive parts of the industry that are in-space activities, and where are those customers coming from, and where are those successes coming from? And Sunil, do you want to kind of kick us off there?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. There's a big pro and a big con with in-space activity. As mostly a tech seed investor, I'm obsessed with the idea that you can dabble with something, you can make mistakes, iterate, and improve. And that's true when you're building a new piece of code, a new mobile app, or even better, a new website. You change a line of code, hit refresh, and you can iterate that pace. So what is the con of in-space activity is you are so far away, 500 kilometers, or 2 years away because you had to build it, ship it, launch it, that you don't really get a lot of swings at the bat. You don't get to tinker very much unless you can somehow transition into a software problem. But anything that is maneuvering, docking, adjusting, you kind of get one swing every year or two. And that's a tricky way to do startups. The pro, though, is that this area is clearly, there's clearly demand for it. And it's total white space. There are virtually no companies doing it right now. So those are the pros and cons that I'm thinking about balancing and for any investor. But if someone can figure out either jump to the right solution without iteration or figure out a way to allow iteration even at massive arm's length, then you could have some success.
Well, and one of the interesting ideas around these suborbital capabilities, the billion, in addition to billionaires taking selfies, there's maybe an opportunity to do iterative microgravity research, at least in early stages, using those capabilities. Eric, how do you think about the in-space activities side of the market?
Yeah, I'm very bullish about in-space activities. As you know, the I think the floodgates, I don't know if it's a flood, but certainly the gates have been opened with what we saw the last few weeks with Branson and Bezos, opening up that frontier, if you will, for destinations. I think you're going to see a lot more interest in that. I think at the suborbital level, I think that's going to draw a lot of excitement for a time, but then there'll be a yearning for more orbital travel. I see the cost going down eventually, probably sooner than people think on a suborbital. And again, that's going to motivate, that's going to be a stepping stone for people to do more orbital travel and whatever that means. And what I think that should and could mean is commercial destinations, commercial space stations. And I think NASA really needs to get on board with this and not to just throw it at NASA. Congress has got to be supportive of this, of supporting this growing economy with $5.6 billion already this year that has been invested in opening up this second frontier, if you will. So I think that is really an area that we should focus on. The idea of doing more and more human-tended payloads for research in microgravity. I think that's going to open up opportunities, whether it be from pharmaceutical or whomever. Pharmaceutical is obviously an easy one, but certainly Case has had a great experience of working with a lot of different customers that do this type of microgravity research and a variety of that type of research that can be done using humans. It's a twofer, really. You're expanding that space, but you're also getting really credible work done and experiments done. So and I'd like to see that next step, with the commercial destinations, LEO destinations, and what that can mean. So that's where I'm at on that.
So Sunil is cautiously optimistic. Eric is very bullish. Tom, you're looking at this from a national security standpoint, and with a pretty broad definition of national security. We can all think of innumerable satellite applications for national security. We've started to hear about defense interest in the cislunar environment and some concerns around that, but I don't tend to think of national security applications as being related to human spaceflight or in-space manufacturing. So how are you looking at that?
Yeah, it's a good question on the cislunar piece. Is obviously it's attracting a lot of interest right now. From our standpoint, just at Incutel and the government customers we're talking about, we're not getting asked a lot to go look at things sort of that far out. It's much more it's still around the sort of the LEO and GEO type realms. And that's just a function of who we're dealing with on the intelligence community side. So we're not getting asked about human space flight. We're not getting asked about the cislunar or lunar operations right now. That may change though pretty soon. In terms of the investment opportunities, I was going to say, I'm bullish too, with a caveat that timing is everything. So too early means you're wrong. So all of this stuff is going to happen, and the question is the pace in which it happens and when the customers show up. So, for example, satellite servicing, I think, is a really interesting area. The question is sort of when does that market develop? How fast? Who pays what for it? What's the regulatory side? All these things I think are still being answered. So as we think about when the customers are going to show up and when the real revenue is going to be there, I think it's still developing. But I'm absolutely bullish on the fact that we will have an in-space economy, pretty soon here. And I think the other piece of that is we were talking a little bit about the access to space through the launch availability. That's really changing rapidly. And I think as that happens, whether or not we have way too many competitors, we talk more about. But I think the more access we have to space, the more people are going to figure out interesting things to do in space that we haven't really thought of at this point.
So Tess, you're sort of you're the pure play venture investor on this question, right? The later stage, the bigger deals. What's your view of the in-space economy and those opportunities around manufacturing and platforms and so on?
Well, I do imagine a future where we travel to space with the frequency in which we currently travel in an aircraft. And I want to go. I'm in Eric's bullish, get me in space. But taking off my aerospace engineer hat that just selfishly really wants to experience zero gravity and the overview effect of the Earth, and putting on my investor hat, I think it's important to set some context that only 2% of businesses are venture backed. It's a very, very small asset class because investors look for hockey stick, or in this case, rocket ship growth, very quick growth in a very small amount of time. And I think it's really important. And I urge and I ask every company that pitches, like, are you sure venture is the right avenue for you? There's so many alternatives. There's bank debt, loan, government grants. Bank debt's great, but usually, I mean, have to pay it back with some interest. Government loans are great because it's non-dilutive. And then bootstrapping, which is the best. And of course, a combination or a nice little cocktail of all of those work as well. Secondly, I think something Tom said that was spot on is Tom, correct me if I misquote you, but if you're off on timing, you're basically wrong. And I think we're from an investor perspective where my limited partners need their money back in a shorter time horizon. I worry a bit about the space-to-base economy at the moment. However, I think a really exciting reason we'll get there is these private-public partnerships between NASA and private companies. It's proven remarkably successful with SpaceX. It's launched over 20 cargo resupply missions to the International Space Station. And last May, there was the monumental launch of astronaut Doug and Bob to the International Space Station. So I think these PPPs are going to be really exciting for the industry, and will hopefully get it to a point where we can have more venture capital investment in the industry as well.
Thanks, Tess. So generally speaking, a good deal of optimism framed with a lot of, but here's what has to happen. Government partnership, realistic opportunities, the right timing. Let's talk a little bit about, there's an interesting audience question about the structure of successful businesses. Whether, so the question is, we've seen sort of vertically integrated launch companies that have moved to satellite operations, for example. So the question is, are there other opportunities for that kind of integration? And I would say that I'm not sure that there's been, that door has been open. I don't know that we would necessarily say, yes, that model is fully proven. I think we're in the sort of evaluating how the business case plays out, and we've got a limited amount of time and a lot of questions. So maybe Tess, what's your thought on other areas where we might see vertical integration, and then anyone else can jump in if they want. We'll go on to the next.
So I think if I'm reading the question that you're referring to, it's talking about a lot of the launch vehicle or the rocket companies vertically integrating and also owning the satellite. So the two big examples are SpaceX launching Falcon 9 and now building Starlink, a constellation of satellites to provide the world with ubiquitous, Sunil, internet constellation coverage. Don't you just love when ubiquitous is used all the time? Ubiquity.
It's ubiquitous.
Everywhere. The second example of this is Rocket Lab with our Photon satellites. So Rocket Lab first built an Electron rocket and now is building a Photon satellite so that SpaceX can launch its satellites on its rocket and Rocket Lab can launch its satellites on its rocket. I think the second best part of the space stack to combine and vertically integrate is the satellites owning the hardware with the software. So a company that is a really good example of this is Spire has the largest general purpose CubeSat constellation in space, and it gets a bunch of raw data. Like, it gets a bunch of data that's not really usable, but it also has a software analytics team to analyze all of that data and give our customers the not raw data, but the analyzed data that's most useful for the customer application. I think that's a really crucial part to vertically integrate, is all of these companies that are building satellites to launch into space, so they own all of the hardware, vertically integrate and own the software piece as well. It's going to help your margins. It's going to maybe turn you into a space SaaS company, a SPAC company. It's a totally different set of skills, but I think it's really crucial to have those types of companies combined.
Thanks, Tess. Let's talk a little bit about the government's role. We touched on that in a number of different places, and Eric and Tom, maybe you can weigh in on this. So what is the role of government? We've talked about public-private partnerships. We've talked about the government as a regulator. How do you view the government's appropriate role in this growing space ecosystem? And Eric, you spent a good chunk of your life talking to the government about what its role should be on behalf of venture-funded space companies as the president of Commercial Spaceflight Federation, and now you're in the field in a different way. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, what the role of government is really could be the beginning of a doctoral thesis, in certain fields the past couple of years as we look at each administration, what the role should be. Narrowly focused and selfishly speaking, I look at the role of government from the kaleidoscope of space and how they can be helpful in expanding and helping democratize space for our nation and for and like-minded nations around the world that see a similar worldview to us. So in that effort, I think we've had very good success working with the government, working at agencies on cutting back on overburden regulatory practices that just are unnecessary and outdated, updating the regulations that need to just help enhance commercial industry to grow and not to hold it back. I was shocked, but I guess not surprised. Maybe a day after the successful New Shepard launch with Jeff Bezos on it, that a member of Congress introduced legislation to tax spaceflight participants, like a fossil fuel tax on the rocket fuel or something to that extent. It was such a nonsensical piece of legislation. I really discounted it, but it did anger me that this is what some people use the taxpayer time to do. So I'm against that legislation, needless to say. But I feel the role of government is to really help and Tess, really put a finger on it with the public-private partnerships. The way, let's just take NASA, for instance. NASA's budget of about $25 billion. What is taking up that budget? These big line items. SLS has certainly been a large part of that budget, and Space Station has as well. Not to fault SLS on its cost, because that was the design was before what we're seeing now. So now we have alternatives to that. So I don't see NASA going down that path of building a vehicle like that under the specifications and the contract mechanism that they did on SLS. But the opportunity is the cost savings that they will have and where they can use that cost savings and invest in the commercial sector to help grow, to help them partner in doing the things that NASA wants to do to help expand their mission, to go deeper, to go further in exploration and to help that mission that they have long since excelled at. And the commercial sector will help do that. And by leveraging these public-private partnerships, by relying on the technology that exists in the commercial sector, that's going to free up capital to do more investment. It's just like with the cost of launch going down, when you don't have to pay $120 million just for a ticket to space, and that cost comes down by 2/3. The capabilities that you can do, the advancements in technologies you can do, the miniaturization that you can experience, I think that's where we're going to see the breakthrough. That's where the relationship with industry and government has to be really effectively communicated and realized. So that's I think going to be a huge factor in the coming years.
So the government as an enabler and a partner with a vision to better meeting government mission goals, but a very expansive long-term vision.
Augmenting the government goals, obviously that should be the primary purpose for the government on what they invest in and how they see. But that also the commercial benefits that come from those investments and the commercial benefits that can enhance what they want to do is critical to realize that, and how these pieces all fit together.
Thanks. So Tom, the same question, what should be the government's role? And let's add a little flavor onto that. There's an interesting audience question, which is, should NASA invite investors to advise in its evaluation of business cases for proposals? And the question is about space production applications, but generally speaking, how much does the government listen to investors in making decisions about what businesses to invest in? You're probably very well positioned to speak to that as well.
Yeah, let me answer it along 3 different lines here, I think. One is just more generally, I think Eric nailed it on the, what the government should do, among other things, is create the right framework for success in space. So, don't burden these commercial companies with too much in the way of regulatory burden. And then also do the things that are going to allow us and our allies to succeed. So we are in a race with some adversaries up in space. We need to keep an eye on that. And I think one of the things we need to do is create the conditions for us to leverage all the things that we as a country bring to bear, and that includes the commercial sector. So the government just creating the right framework, I think, is a big step here. From the intelligence community standpoint, and I'll stick with sort of the remote sensing angle here. I think what the government needs to do is paint the right requirements. Put them out there. This is what we need. This is the type of thing we're looking for. We would like to be a customer, and then guide the commercial sector to those things. And it doesn't have to be incredibly prescriptive, but it should be enough that somebody knows if they develop something, it's got a likelihood of being sold to the government and being meaningful. So I think the more the government does that and acts as a customer instead of sort of we have to own everything. I've said this before, but I think that's kind of key here. And in the remote sensing sector, you think about like optical, SAR, RF, et cetera. We need to see more of those government contracts transitioning to bigger dollars for the commercial sector. And then back to the NASA question here for a second. I think in general, whether it's NASA or anybody else on the government side, yeah, I do think there's some benefit in having, venture type investors look at things like that and just weigh in from a business perspective, because it frankly is really a different angle than I think most of these government agencies are looking at. And it matters. I mean, if you try to figure out who's going to be sustainable and who's not, there are a lot of things that we look at as investors that just don't cross the mind of the government. So I do think that'd be valuable.
I'll add a note on the particularly, you see it on the remote sensing side, but across the array of businesses. The idea that you can prevent commercial space companies from doing things that implementing capabilities that are militarily sensitive, I think is really difficult, because if you shut those companies down or constrain them, what you're doing often is creating an opportunity for a non-US company to step in and fill that market gap. And so you end up in a less secure rather than a more secure position. I always feel like that. I feel like that is a really hot topic that we're starting to grapple with. Sunil, if I could turn to you for a question about investment against company maturity, and then we'll finish up with a lightning round of the very easy to answer question: what is the future of investment in commercial space? Highlighting the future of SPACs. So everyone sort of prepped for a 2-minute answer on that. But Sunil, while we have our last question, so we're seeing all of this capital coming into the industry. You're tracking the maturity levels of companies, how they're maturing. You're looking for seed opportunities. Is that changing? Are you seeing more early stage deals? Are you seeing more companies in a later stage looking for funding? How's that look to you now, and how's that changing?
I can speak more to the earlier stage. The later stage, I don't. I have a little bit of the pulse on, but the earlier stage, I do spend quite a bit of time following. I would say that usually the kind of risk that I'm seeking to use money to buy down has to do with that initial spark of a happy customer. Doesn't always mean paying. It just means it could even be a sentence. You know, you say the sentence to a potential customer, their eyes light up. That might make me invest. Now, in order to have that would be like business plan meets market. Often in the past has required a lot of extra time, work, and money to get to that point. But as we build up more infrastructure, like nanoracks, for example, can get you to the station, Loft Orbital, Rocket Lab. As these companies come to fruition, it's easier to imagine a path where a meaningfully small amount of capital can unlock that one question. I always think about capital as unlocking question after question. And one of the first questions is, does anyone want it? And that's a trickier question than it seems. That's actually most of my work at Ubiquity, is figuring out, does anyone wants this thing? And so I think companies are getting savvier about using the infrastructure tools, about using a few $1 million to unlock that question. You know, usually I invest about $1 million in a 1 or 2 person team, and that used to be preposterous in space that could buy down any risk. And more recently, it's actually pretty meaningful that you can actually make some progress on a few $1 million to, I don't know about turn on revenue, but definitely unlock a few critical questions to then unlock more capital. So I see more seed space startups than ever, and I think it's a really good thing. It's bleeding into like Y Combinator, the storied incubator accelerator. That's bleeding into other areas. Techstars has a great space accelerator, Starburst. So it's a robust ecosystem. I've never seen it stronger.
Thanks, Sunil. So that's a perfect transition to our lightning round question of, where do you see the investment environment going, opportunities, and particularly, are SPACs here to stay in space, or is this a moment in time situation? And if we could all take about 2 minutes to give an answer to that, that would be great. So let's kick off with you, Sunil.
It's a good question. I'll reiterate what I started with, which is, I'll say it a different way. There are a lot of people waiting to say, I told you so. This is just another 2000s run up, or even 2010 run up. So I think as these SPACs, I think they get announced, and then a few months later they actually go public and they trade, and maybe the lockup expires. So ironically, it's not just the liquidity, it's sort of the performance in the public markets of how this stuff is accepted. I think with Momentous, we saw some hiccups along the way, even before it's going public. So we need to watch those closely to see. But all of those downstream liquidity events and the performance impact upstream, meaning earlier in the process, folks like me and our appetite to do space. So jury's still out, but at the moment, there's more. I just look to the Series A folks to lead my deals after I do a seed, and I've never seen more interest in space from Series A folks.
Thanks, Sunil. Eric, what's your take?
I have mixed emotions on the SPAC craze. I see it's a great opportunity for some. It's a streamlined approach. It provides that burst of capital that a lot of people need. But I also see some really silly valuations that just, to even a layman like myself, I just cannot understand these valuations and what these the investors are looking at in these companies. So that worries me. It worries me that all these investments are, vehicles are chasing a limited number of attractive businesses, and it's driving up the cost of a lot of these companies. And if companies' acquisition prices become too inflated, the return value for the SPAC becomes more drawn out, and I think that could have a detrimental effect. So certainly, some of these SPACs, have done well and will do well, but others could really have a negative impact on the investment community, and it could push investors into other areas. So that concerns me. But generally speaking, I'm upbeat. I see so much potential in the industry. I see so much innovation that's ripe for the picking. I see greater government cooperation. I am truly upbeat about that. So my grade is a B plus. So
thanks, Eric. Tom, where do you fall on where we're going and the durability of SPACs for space?
I think things are really frothy right now, and so I think this is not going to be a sort of uninterrupted path to greatness here. We're going to. I think it's great that things are exiting, but at some point, I think the SPACs will get reined in a little bit just from a regulatory side. They won't go away, but I think how they get formulated is going to change a little bit. I think that'll have an effect on on throughout the ecosystem, where right now it's really pretty easy to raise a private round for a space company. And I don't think maybe, a year from now it's going to look completely the same, but I don't think it's going away anytime. I think, we're on a good path here. You look over the next 5 or 10 years, I think this is nothing but a growth story. But I don't think it's going to be sort of uninterrupted, smooth sailing kind of story. And as I was thinking back to 5-6 years ago, and both I think Tess and Sunil would say this too. Like, you think about who was investing in the space sector back then, and we would have all fit into one room. And now I've got people just coming out of the woodwork talking. People have never done anything related to space or talking to me about, their basket of space companies. So it's pretty frothy right now. I think that'll get slightly corrected.
People are exiting that just entered. That's the amazing thing.
That's exactly right. Tess, future of investment in space and space SPACs. Wrap us up.
There's nothing inherently evil about SPACs. SPACs are just another way for companies to go public, but particularly at an earlier stage in their development. So they're just like an IPO, but with a big structural difference. In the case of a SPAC, the SPAC can share long-term projections with the institutional buyers. And this makes them a good fit for space companies or companies that have ambitions in 5 years from now to make a very large amount of sales, to generate $1 billion in sales. And they're even more so a good fit for space companies because they unlock public pools of capital that historically weren't available. At the end of 2020, Virgin Galactic was one of the few space companies available for the public to invest in. At the end of this year, there's going to be a dozen plus added to that list. And I really look forward to, in the future, the next generation and the big uptick of investment in the industry due to this path that Rocket Lab and Spire and the dozen other space SPACs are paving.
Thank you, Tess. And with that, we'll wrap up our panel on investing in space with a realistic optimism coming from our panelists who spend their lives and make their livings doing this job. I absolutely agree that the publicly traded SPACs are going to provide a new insight into the performance of space companies and the health of the sector. And it is going to be an exciting ride over the next few years. I'd like to thank the ISS conference for inviting us to be here as part of this event. And Jim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Excellent. Carissa, thank you. Tess, Eric, Sunil, Thomas, thank you all very much. Frothy, what a great word. Yeah, I actually jumped into the market and withdrew just during this session. So yeah, it's all happening very quickly. So yeah, this brings us to the end of day 2 of the 2021 ISSRD conference. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We appreciate it. But be sure to join us for day 3 tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern. We have another great lineup, including Emmy-nominated science TV host Emily Calandrelli, who will moderate our STEM panel. So thank you again to our platinum sponsor, Boeing, and all of our silver sponsors and exhibitors. Do not forget to stop by their virtual booths today or tomorrow. If you do, you could be the winner of an ISS Above device and an Oculus headset with access to the ISS Experience episodes 1 and 2, courtesy of our partners at Felix and Paul Studios. The winner of that will be announced tomorrow at 12:45 p.m. And finally, a quick reminder that our virtual technical sessions of this conference with live Q&A will run Monday, August 16 through Wednesday, August 18. We've got 60 presentations and posters covering a variety of subject areas, so there's definitely something for everybody. You can register to attend the technical sessions by going to the ISS conference website and clicking the technical sessions link at the top of the screen. So thank you again very much for joining us today. We look forward to having you all with us tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.